Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into maybe a show today. Fortunately, we get to call into this show over the phone line because my computer is just sitting on a screen and not moving. So, not quite sure what I'm going to do. Can't call the guest because I don't have the phone number because that's in the computer. Can't get into the switchboard in case he happens to call in to unmute his mic. Oh, man, oh, man. Anyway, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, psychic readings or clairvoyant readings, and energy medicine services. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And at that site, you can find out about becoming a medical intuitive, intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner, all from the comfort of your own home. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. So this week we're supposed to be, well, let me tell you a couple of different things. This Saturday, if you happen to be located in the Texas area, is the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference. That's being held in spooky Jefferson, Texas. And I'm there most of the time. I'm usually there, and we'll be speaking about 2012, and it's a really interesting presentation that I'll be giving. And also going to be there is Dash Beardsley, who talks about, my computer's coming up, Dash Beardsley, who runs a ghost tour in Galveston. Very cool guy. Larry Flaxman's going to be there. There's some different paranormal groups that are going to be there. And one of the extra coolest things about doing this show in Jefferson is, and if you've listened to the show before, you've heard me talk about this city. It is the most haunted city in the state of Texas. And so one of the things that they do as part of this event is they have ghost hunting in the evening, and this year, amazingly, they are going to be doing 5 different locations. And so if you do come to the event tomorrow in Jefferson, Texas, you'll be able to participate in going to 5 different spooky locations, which is really, really a fun thing to do. Okay, so let's see. Hang on one second. Let me get this other screen up online, and hopefully we will be able to get Micah, who's supposed to be coming on the show today. So let me call him. So you're going to hear some beeping and some ringing, but just bear with me here. Hi, Micah. It's Dr.
How
Rita.
are you?
How are you? Stressing out. Let me tell you. Boy, oh boy.
What's up?
Well, it's very interesting. And, well, actually, let me do the formal intro, and then we'll get into this, because actually it's even more interesting. But hang on. I'll fill you in on the details. Okay.
No problem.
So
Take your time.
Today's guest is Micah Hanks, and we're going to be talking about magic, mysticism, and the molecule. And Micah is a self-proclaimed but not self-righteous skeptic, and he works as a writer and radio personality in search of answers to life's enduring mysteries. He has contributed articles and stories regarding strange phenomena, scientific discovery, breathe, Rita, breathe, discoveries, and political topics to magazines like Fate Magazine, Fortean Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, UFO Magazine, TCS Daily, the Journal of Anomalous Sciences, Intrepid Magazine, New Dawn, and several others. So from the Grailient Report, the author of Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule, Micah Hanks. Okay. Hi, Micah. I am so glad to have you on the other end of the line.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm glad to be here, Rita, and I tell you, it's always my pleasure to be able to talk to you. You're one of the favorites of mine out there, so it's good to be here on a Friday afternoon, rocking out with you.
Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th. Who else would I want to spend a day like Friday the 13th with?
I know. Check that out. So I wanted to open the show and talk to you about an article I saw online, but I just want to share with you what happened. And so
okay.
I'm called into the show, and I'm trying to get into the little studio thing online, and it won't work. And so I figure I need to reboot my machine. So I rebooted, and it's just sitting and sitting and sitting for 10 minutes. It's that. Before it came back up, and I'm like, he kind of talks about ghost things, and every time we do a ghost show or have somebody that talks about ghosts somewhere in their thing, and I'm doing a ghost show tomorrow. I'll be at the History, Haunts, and Legends conference tomorrow. Computer wackiness makes me crazy. Anyway, so where I wanted to start, which has nothing to do with your book, was yesterday I was online looking for, actually, bizarre as this may sound, radio shows that I have been on, because I wanted to include links on my site, which I didn't keep track of, and so I figured I'd go into a search engine and look myself up and look for links to shows that I was on. And in my perusing, I found this link with this article, and I had the article on my screen, but that's gone now, that had your name in it, and it had a very good friend of the show, Nick Redfern's name in it, and my name in it. And what was that about? It was something about phone lines in my show, and then this whole conundrum thing happened. I'm going, man, what an appropriate place to start with, like, weird technology things happening. So what was that article about? I mean, are you the one that wrote the article? I couldn't quite figure that part out.
Yeah, that if it's the same one I'm thinking about with regard to telephone weirdness, that probably appeared at Mysterious Universe, the website, which is mysteriousuniverse.org. And indeed, I write for Mysterious Universe, as does Nick. And it was kind of funny and serendipitous, if not synchronistic outright, as is often the case with things in this field. And in that particular instance, the deal with that article had been that I had been experiencing, get this, telephonic weirdness in varying degrees. It was something that was really becoming quite perplexing for me, because the more that I began to I guess, because I do radio and things like that also, the more that I've begun to do television, or not television, but radio interviews with people on my own, where I would contact them, where I would go on somebody else's program, I had just begun to notice quite frequently what I could only say was a propensity for strange things happening on the telephone. And then it starts to kind of filter over into just personal correspondences and telephone calls I make throughout the day. What exactly I'm describing would be, just weird noises, maybe in the background, something like that. My telephone would seem to cut itself off automatically, turn itself back on. I'd see the red LED light just inexplicably just kind of light up as though the phone were literally like it had a mind of its own. I'm thinking, is my phone possessed? What in the world is going on? And I'll tell you, Rita, what it reminded me of so much. It reminded me of the sorts of things that John Keel wrote about in the Mothman Prophecies. At one point, he had said that there was so much weirdness going on with his telephone that he literally went to the phone company and asked if he could if he could, see if there was some way that they could literally just try and diagnose the problem for him and help him determine where all the problems on his phone line were coming through, all the pops, all the hisses, all the strange little backward noises and things coming through. The phone line had apparently, according to Keel, been tapped, and that he'd had the phone company come out and check it out, and indeed that they'd actually found that there was a telephone line, something along the lines of, and keeping in mind this took place back in probably the late 1960s, so technology is far greater beyond this at this point today. But nonetheless, for the 1960s, he said that he'd found that there was apparently a line that had been connected that was monitoring his direct line at his home and had been watching, apparently, various or monitoring various different conversations he'd been having. So that was a little disconcerting. I can't say that I've had anyone monitoring my phone calls, but there had definitely been a lot of synchronistic weirdness, and my phone had been behaving kind of strangely. So what I decided to do was I said, I'll make an article out of it, even though I'm not, again, someone who thinks that his telephone is being listened in on or anything like that. The most I can say is that every now and then I do an interview where there are a lot more people out there who are listening to a telephone conversation like this one than most people would have, of course, because it's going out over the air. So I asked Nick Redfern, I said, Nick, you do a lot more of this sort of stuff, with regard to secret things. His new book, I think, is called Keep Out, and it's all about secret government facilities and things that people aren't supposed to know about. So I thought, he'd be a likely candidate for someone who's had a lot of telephone weirdness. And I asked him, I said, Nick, have you ever had anything strange happen with telephone lines before? And he said, no, really can't say that I have. And I was hoping for something so that I could include it in that article. But lo and behold, I believe the very next day, Nick probably had gone on I think it was your radio program, if I remember correctly, and had experienced this strange thing where the call dropped and there was all kinds of weird noise and everything going on. And so I get this email from Nick after he goes on your show, and he says, listen, you're not going to believe what happened. Right after you'd asked me about this, all of a sudden, now, yes, here I am. I've had this strange thing happen. And no less while we were talking about, get this, the subject was Men in Black, MIBs, which Nick has written a book about. So,
and I think that was the topic we were talking about on the radio show that day.
At that very moment, yes, indeed. So it was pretty interesting, to say the least, that all that, the stars aligned in such a way that transpired. And he contacted me and told me, so that was pretty weird that you'd asked about that, because I think maybe for the first time I had something really weird happen on Rita's program.
It happens on the show a lot. I don't know if you know who John Lear is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
My phone line died. Just flat died. I couldn't get back into the switchboard, and so but I'm pretty smart, and so I called in on my cell phone and then answered my cell phone as if I was a guest and ran the rest of the show that way.
Good.
Because I'm smart. I'm trickier than them FBI people, the Men in Black people. But, no, it happens, I don't want to say regular. It really depends on the topic. When it's, ghost people or people that, investigate, I'm going to say otherworldly beings, not necessarily UFOs, but otherworldly beings, and conspiracy theory stuff. That's when I usually have the biggest problems. And I think the ghosty stuff is just, ghost energy kind of getting into it. But that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today anyway, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's the funny thing, too, I want to point out is before we get into the discussion of what might be real, what I would call, if not just simply non-human intelligences, maybe even sentient intelligences that are not from this same state of reality as you or I would, or most people would generally perceive. I mean, I might make an exception for you because I know of your psychic prowess. You may be a little more attuned to these kinds of things than the average bear, so to speak. But that said, most people don't generally go up and down the street, in their daily life and claim to have encounters with alien beings and things like that. Nonetheless, there are those strange incidents that kind of set aside these questions in our mind about what and how much of our reality that we are able to perceive normally under normal, repeatable and the kind of anticipated circumstances that we encounter daily, what exists beyond that? Some people actually think the MIB phenomena, rather than being, just government spooks going around, and giving people a hard time after they've seen a UFO or something along those lines. A lot of people have asserted over the years that there are various behaviors and activities associated with the Men in Black phenomena that may even point to something a little bit beyond the normal, certainly beyond normal, but something even maybe beyond the human side of things. So that kind of idea of non-human intelligence comes into question, even with that subject, and I'm sure we'll dig into a lot more of it over the course of this conversation.
And I'm sure we will. And just one last comment about the whole synchronistic thing.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that article yesterday, and then, I was doing something around the house, and then I stopped and went, wait a minute, I have Micah on the show tomorrow. Dang, I'm going to ask him about it. Because I could have, Nick was on a few months ago. Nick has a cot set up in the studio because he is so prolific that it seems like I have him back on. This is how it usually works. I have him on. We talked about Men in Black. It was like the next week Keep Out was being released. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll just put you back on the cot and, have you come back on in a few months.
That's what's so wonderful about Nick, though. He is so multifaceted. And, I personally just can't say enough good things about Nick. I do know him personally. I know in this field, a lot of people they meet. I put up air quotes here when I'm saying this, they meet through emails or things like that. And I've actually spent time with Nick in person. We've ridden around Asheville, North Carolina together, and, I've attended lectures and things like that. We've gone out to eat, had a beer. So, with Nick, I really know him. I really like him a lot, and he's truly not only a good buddy, but he's really one of the very best researchers that's out there today in my mind, and I do stand by that.
Well, you'll have to come to Texas because he only lives about 25 minutes from me.
Oh, no. So now, are you talking about a literal cot there in the studio then?
Well, that too. Well, I don't know. My husband might not appreciate that too much.
Sure. Yeah, he's close enough. You might as well just come over and crash with you guys, right?
Yeah. How did you become interested in the whole concept of paranormal and unseen things and conspiracy theories? Because, in the mainstream world, that's not obviously a mainstream thing to become interested in.
That's not something that people, generally recommend that you dedicate your life to, like I've done and like you've done as well. Well, maybe we're just weird, Rita. That's really what it's all about. But
not me.
To give you, not you. Well, yeah, exactly. As I like to say, and I've got other colleagues that say it too. For us, the supernatural is natural. And what is paranormal is quite normal for us. At least it begins to be that way. I don't think we're dealing with things that exist outside the bounds of the known sciences. I don't think that in the least. I think what we're dealing with various different kinds of paranormal phenomena are quite simply this: aspects of the known universe which remain unknown, unquantified by science, only because our understanding of science and the known universe is incomplete. As soon as we start saying that we know everything and that all the answers are right before us, they might be in front of us, but I don't think that we've taken on a tactile, complete and methodological understanding of all those things. We can't write down patterns and procedures on paper and come back and refer to page 78 whenever we want to ask about what a ghost is or what a UFO is. We don't have that kind of data yet. That's all. It doesn't mean that these things are non-scientific because they cannot be understood by science. We just don't have a complete understanding of the sciences necessary to quantify these phenomena. But back to your initial question, how did I get involved in all this? Knowing, and I don't think I knew it at the outset, but knowing today what I know about the pitfalls and the perils that await people in terms of their credibility if they get involved in this kind of thing. I was blessed to have a couple of parents who kind of saw past those stereotypes, that exist in our culture today. And at an early age, I was 5 years old probably, 4 or 5 years old, and I was given, the first book I really remember being given was a book by Ivan P. Sanderson called Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life. It was a cryptozoology book. It dealt with Bigfoot and things like that. And a lot of people who study Bigfoot, I'm sure some of your listenership will know this because they're, of course, the kind of well-informed individuals who are attuned to this kind of subject matter. At least we certainly hope that they are, and I don't doubt that they are. But Ivan Sanderson was one of these early researchers before really the name for Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Before those expressions were really widely and popularly used. And so when we talk about Bigfoot from that era, there was a term that Sanderson used, and that term was abominable snowmen of the Americas. Mm-hmm. It was kind of fun. The only real cultural staple that we had at that point was the abominable snowman. And this is, of course, a reference to this large creature known as the Yeti that exists in the Himalayan mountain range. So, again, that book was probably one of the first books that ever introduced me to strange phenomena. And then second to it was another book about Bigfoot, Peter Burns' Bigfoot, Man, Myth, or Monster, perhaps not in that particular order. I don't recall that clearly, the subtitle of that book. And then finally there was a book by Ray Fowler that was called UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors, which in a lot of ways was most enigmatic of all because of a few things. Bigfoot, for all we know, is a physical, biological entity. At some point over the course of this conversation, I'd like to get into some alternate theories about that. We'll take those things as they come. But when we look at a book like Ray Fowler's UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors, it's interesting because the cover of that, it was an old paperback novel, and that book had a prototypical flying saucer hovering in the night sky on the cover. And I'll never forget that book. I've still got it, in fact, the very same edition that my parents gave me so many years ago. I'll never forget that book because it, unlike these things known to this earth or even unknown to this earth, this book dealt with the potential for there being visitors from other planets outside of terra firma, this wonderful little mudball we know and that we call Earth. And I was fascinated, even at a young age like that, Rita, I was fascinated with the idea that, my gosh, are we talking about real people from space, for lack of a better term? And that was kind of my introduction. And I think the introduction to those books and, the real strict, passion and adherence to, method and procedure that these researchers had applied, keeping in mind, again, that, for instance, Ivan Sanderson, he was a zoologist. He was trained. He had been all over the world. He had been to places most, people would never set foot, and he had seen things as a result of that many would never see. These were men of science who were taking every bit of energy and every resource that they had and putting all of it behind the study of things as yet unknown to science. They were the last vestiges, I think, of the adventure spirit. We had Christopher Columbus back in the 1490s, Well, today we've got these people who are looking for the remaining mysteries of this planet, and it's so terrible to me that mainstream science likes to take this attitude that, well, A, we either know everything, or B, the more open-minded scientists will tell you all those strange phenomena, or what we perceive as strange phenomena, is interesting sometimes, albeit peripherally. I think that the big problem is that we have to look at what are, the things that fall within the jurisdictions of known science and try and solve those mysteries first before we start worrying about the weird stuff. And therefore, a lot of these great mysteries, UFOs, ghosts and hauntings, psychic phenomena, they tend to be overlooked by the mainstream as a result of that. And that's a real tragedy because we really, in a sense, are putting limitations on thought. And therefore, as a result of that early influence and as I've gotten older, the kind of disgust that I've developed with the way that so much of mainstream science approaches this stuff, it's become a very passionate subject for me. And, of course, the ongoing research has really become something that I've had the blessing of being able to do more and more professionally over the last few years.
But it seems like when you look at things that mainstream science will buy into, and I agree with you about the whole paranormal, ghost, UFO area, they don't really want to touch it. But when you look at the archaeological, anthropological, like when were the pyramids built? How long has civilization been here? It's like they have this hardcore line of first there were the Sumerians, then there were the Egyptians, and, Egypt came into its own, and then 500 years later they built the pyramids. It's like, please.
I know.
And they don't want to move from that line. They don't want to open themselves up, and that's one of the things that I find frustrating about science is that even if they find this great stuff, they're very hesitant to come out with it.
Oh,
they
absolutely.
might know it in their heart, but they're not willing to publish.
Exactly. And you know, Rita, you probably experienced that as much as anybody else. I know I have. I have professional contacts in the realms of microbiology, linguistics, physics, history. Literally, I could probably, if it weren't for the fact that I wouldn't give these people's names out of respect for the work that they do, and out of, the respect for the friendship that I have with these individuals, but I could probably, if I had to, name, between 7 and 10 people just right off the top of my head who I've been contacted by over the past. They've been so kind as to offer to give me, advice on various subjects and things regarding the strange and unusual, and yet they couldn't go about it. They couldn't give their own testimony, so to speak, because they would be literally putting their professional careers at stake, despite their own passion or own interest in strange phenomena and what we appear to know as the unexplained and paranormal. These people literally would run the risk of career suicide if they were to go out in a public forum and talk about these things. And so what they're relegated to having to do, a lot of people, of course, would give them a hard time, I think, and would try and say, well, unfortunately, you must understand that if you don't put your stuff on, and if you don't literally put all your beliefs out there, then you're just a phony and you're a fraud and you're chicken. I think by the same token, these people want to be able to help, and they definitely feel like they're being corralled by the sciences. And as a result, they do what they can, and they come to people like you or I, and they share their own feelings, and they say, even if I couldn't put that information out to you, or out to the world rather, I'll give it to you and give you my guidance and lend my insight to that. I see that a lot, and I know a lot of people personally who are kind of relegated to having to operate within that capacity.
Yeah, and it's just sad. Sad.
Yeah.
But let's turn our focus and talk about your book, Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule. And your book focuses on an ongoing search or relationships with unseen forces. And can you just kind of set the stage for where our discussion, in a very general way, what these relationships or what these forces are that, because I feel like once we set that stage and create a platform, then we can kind of get into the meat of it.
Sure, absolutely. On the base level, what Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule really deals with is, although the subtitle says, the search for sentient intelligence from other worlds, primarily what is the focus of that book is the use of altered states of consciousness to reach those quote-unquote other worlds. And what that entails, of course, as people probably have already kind of discerned, is that we're not always talking about an actual visitation to another physical place. When I say other worlds, there may be different states of being, different levels of dimensional reality. There are certainly times that I've questioned whether dimensionality as we know it even comes into question. I have some brilliant contacts, especially in the realm of physics, who have spent long hours explaining to me the illusory nature of space and time, and the fact that time, which I think to a certain degree, thanks to the observable effects of Einsteinian thought processes applied to space and time. Think about, for instance, time dilation and these sorts of things. We begin to see that time and space, for that matter, are not really the constants, the universal constants that most tend to perceive them as being. That's what it really all comes down to, is perception, human perception. And everything around us, everything experiential that we that we encounter and that occurs in our daily lives, all of that is filtered through the human senses. Everything that we encounter is experienced through processes of human perception. And when you begin to alter the natural states of human perception, you can begin to experience things that, again, definitely seem to be, in some way related to intelligences. A lot of people would argue that this can be potentially dangerous, and that could be for a number of reasons. And I think that the primary two should be put out this way, that one interpretation is that there are indeed other intelligences, other entities, and other levels of consciousness and things like this, and that we may potentially, as humans, be able to interact with them. The other interpretation is that this all could stem from within the mind, and that essentially making contact with what we would interpret as being some kind of intelligence from another dimension or another state of reality is essentially, some level of craziness. In other words, if it all stems from within the mind, even though we may perceive that we're having an encounter with a being, we actually are running the risk of encountering madness and loss of our good senses. So, indeed, it's a slippery slope, but I think that as a result of the multiple different interpretations of encounters with, whether it be God, aliens, ghosts, spirits, and things like that throughout our history, and in so many different cultures and in different interpretations and in different mythologies from those cultures, it's well worth, I think, examining the role that altered states of human perception or altered states of consciousness, as I've said, may affect the human ability to relate to aspects of different levels of consciousness and dimensionality. That's what the book really kind of deals with, is that search for sentient intelligence from other worlds, but that, again, may not necessarily entail traveling to Jupiter and hoping to meet an alien, you see. I think that, if anything, if we're going to meet other intelligences, we're more likely probably to have that kind of encounter in a non-physical capacity. That's why altered states of consciousness are so important.
So are we talking about some kind of, and I'm just going to use a very generic word, channeling kind of thing?
In some instances, yeah. And I think that's a fine word to use, Rita.
Well, I have, definite opinions about channeling, but we can talk about that later.
Sure.
Because it seems like, what I gleaned from your book was, there was this whole aspect about communication happening between us and them, or this desire to communicate with these other beings.
That's funny that you bring that up, because we opened the conversation today, for instance, talking about, strange circumstances that are involved with telephone conversations. In other words, anomalies that occur in the midst of different forms of communication. I find it kind of interesting, to be honest with you, that humans are so, I'm thankful for it because, like you and I are having this conversation right now, it's important that we talk. You and I right now are exchanging ideas, and we're sharing those ideas with your audience. So we're reaching, countless numbers of people right now through this conversation. Communication is important because it is the medium by which we exchange ideas, and therefore the ideas proliferate, and in a general sense this is aimed at bettering our lives. Technology is the result of the communication that expresses and exchanges ideas in that way. And so what we're all really trying to do through the act of communication is to answer questions and take on a better understanding of our reality and our universe and utilize those abilities that we garner from the exchange of that information to better our lives. When it comes to communication, I think that between, members of our own species, it's pretty obvious what's going on. And then it goes to the next level. Look at the SETI programs. Look at the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in their many different forms. Even though it may be rather outmoded to continue trying to utilize radio systems to do this, in the future there will no doubt be much more highly advanced methods applied to our attempts at, reaching and contacting and communicating with extraterrestrials. But why? Again, I guess that humans assume that we're going to learn something from extraterrestrials, or we would hope that we would. That's taking a very optimistic approach. Dr. Stephen Hawking has said quite the contrary. If we contact more highly advanced civilizations than us, we could be opening Pandora's box and inviting a very terrible and dangerous presence down to Earth. Or it may not even have to be malevolent in nature for there to be a real threat presented by an extraterrestrial presence coming to Earth or making contact with us. For all we know, they could introduce us to violent pathogens or diseases that could cause a lot of problems for humanity. Could wipe out our species for all we know, and that would be entirely unintentional on their part. Think about the introduction of smallpox, to the Americas and to the Native Americans here. So that kind of thing, we've seen it in our own history, and we have to stop and consider those dangerous potentials with regard to our contact with extraterrestrials. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, we, if not are, I would stop short of saying fascinated, I would say that we are almost mysteriously compelled to engage in that kind of communication with beings that, A, we don't know whether they exist or not, and B, that we don't know the implications of having made that contact once it's been established, what that might lead to. So at the end of the day, it's interesting to me that we are so fascinated with communication, and that seems to be the crux of all this. What are we trying to do? We want to make contact. We want to establish contact. We got to make, we got to relate. And that's what it seems to all be about, relating, making friends and communicating. It's kind of funny when you think about it on those terms, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think about, my background is, definitely in the psychic area, metaphysical area, ancient tradition area. And when I think about the whole concept of beings, okay, there's ghosts, which are, I like to say, they're beings without bodies. But even in the more metaphysical perspective of it, separate from the ghost thing, there are people that channel beings. There are people that talk to their guides or their angels or their higher self. And the reality of it is they are also, people hate when I say this, like angels are beings without bodies too. We just think they're good. It's like a totally politically incorrect perspective on it. But it's, in my opinion, a fact, and it throughout history, from, I'm going to say, the beginning of time, people have had that communication, and you mentioned SETI, and they're sending out radio waves, but if we're receiving communication on a telepathic level, then why would they think that, if we're already receiving that communication, why aren't we exploring that? And why aren't we trying to replicate that kind of transmission out into space, because I think it would be more effective. Like that's the channel they're on.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing that cannot be questioned is, in all likelihood, the present systems that we're utilizing for contacting potential extraterrestrial intelligences and life forms, using primarily radio signals and things like that, it's probably going to be highly ineffective in actually reaching any highly advanced intelligence. We're going to have to think of other methods, and I would not discount in the least in the future the use of what we would call today psychic methods of contacting. I'm sure there are going to be certain people that will laugh and roll their eyes, but there was an article I read in the British Daily Mail just earlier this week that was literally talking about how some of the current Pentagon projects underway right now with regard to bettering our soldiers for combat in the field would utilize technological means of accessing telepathic powers so that you would be able to have non-radio and non-verbal communication. You would have no necessity for having to have bulky equipment and things like that. You would find some way to literally be able to transmit thought on the battlefield. And if there are attempts being made right now at actually utilizing that kind of technology by the U.S. military or any other organization, how much longer before we start utilizing that for other purposes, So who knows in the future what we would call psychic abilities right now. That very well may be the ultimate clincher in terms of finally establishing contact. And for all we know, an advanced civilization has probably already done that, and that they're just waiting for somebody, or they already are in contact with somebody out there like ourselves who has gone one step further and achieved that.
But it sounds like, I've had Stephen Greer on, it sounds like that's something like his group is doing, is projecting out energy, and then they're receiving messages, but then it falls into that channeled information category, which I kind of go,
Yeah, I know. I'm kind of like you, Rita, there, because I get a little frustrated. Let's talk about Stephen Greer just for a moment, because what he says he does, he takes his people out and they try and utilize, again, psychic methods of establishing contact with the presumed occupants of UFOs. That is not unlike what some of the processes, the spiritual sciences, I like to refer to them as described in Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule. It's not unlike some of those that I describe in the book. The difference, though, I think, is that Stephen Greer is someone who while he is a man of science, he has a very curious propensity, I think, for he has a curious propensity for getting involved in seemingly less than credible endeavors. Does that make sense?
That was very kind.
Okay, I know, because I know that a lot of people get on to Stephen Greer, you know. I understand he's a man, again, you know, let me just tell you, Stephen Greer is from right here in Asheville, North Carolina, where I broadcast, and from listening to it. I'm so used to doing radio now. Well, where I'm talking to you from today, you're the broadcaster, but Greer is someone who, you know, he was a trauma surgeon at Mission Hospital. He is a man with a professional and a scientific and a medical background. And for all I know, he is out there talking to aliens, but you have to be very careful when you go out there and you make those sorts of claims. And I think that probably that's the issue that you have with people who claim to be, you know, psychic channelers or whatever else, because when you go out there and you make an extraordinary claim, unfortunately, very often it's difficult to back up those sorts of claims. You have to be measured with it. So, again, there's both good and bad with someone like Stephen Greer, but I see that, you know, he's brought his credentials into question by maybe being a little less than careful with some of the claims that he's made over the years.
Well, and I think with his group, and I mean not meaning to talk bad, but they're not really trained individuals.
Right.
You know, like somebody that goes through a remote viewing program is a trained individual, and so the credibility of what they're returning as far as data is going to be more credible because they're trained, you know, as opposed to, you know, getting all my neighbors in a group and going, are you getting any messages? You know, so there's that aspect that, you know, gets called into question. But then again, there's the piece about, and I'm just going to kind of make a comment and throw it back to you, you know, they're receiving messages, but who are they getting these messages from? You know, if it's just us, who are they getting these messages from and from where? And you can take that wherever you want.
Well, that's a difficult circumstance. Again, you know, I try not to come across as being overly credulous. You know, I think that for some people, making the statement, what if even, you know, if you are so little as open-minded enough to entertain the possibility that the humankind may be in contact with other, you know, extra terrestrial, extra bodily, and even extra human intelligences, extra dimensional for all that, you know, that we know. There are a lot of different, you know, levels of, you know, not physical or human as we know it, that intelligences could manifest, you know, before us, you know, through these mediums. If you're certain people, I think would criticize you for merely having a mind that is open enough to those possibilities, which is kind of a shame. By the same token, however, I think that if you go about it in a reasoned way, there's no harm in speculating, which is what I try and do. And so I hope not to ever come across as being too credulous when I bring up subjects like the potential for those kinds of contact with non-human intelligences. And that said, there are different approaches to, or rather different perspectives culturally from which people come to this and question the nature of the interaction. And I talk about several of these in my book. Obviously, I think ever since the late 1947, not 1947, but the late 1940s in general, and actually, if we really want to say the modern UFO era, let's just say, you know, from World War II on, there were some reports of UFO sightings and things like that, what we would call UFOs at least, and some of them even, you know, allegedly resembling the modern stereotypical flying saucer that do predate World War II, but it was during World War II that both Allied and Axis powers in combat had described seeing strange lights in the sky that seemed intelligently controlled. They were often thought to be different kinds of technology that each side thought that essentially that the other side was working on some sort of clandestine technology, and there was a lot of speculation as to what these alleged Foo Fighters were. They were called other things too from time to time. Russian hail was another name for these things, and there were various other expressions used to describe unidentified flying objects during wartime. And after the Second World War, that's when it became pretty obvious, well, these didn't belong to us, they didn't belong to you guys. And now, this fellow, Kenneth Arnold, it's June 1947, and this fellow flying, you know, out west over Mount Rainier, claims that he sees all these little objects flying like little skipping stones. What are these things? What are they? Where do they come from? It was natural for people to assume that these alleged UFOs came from outer space, that they were aliens, keeping in mind that we as a species or as a civilization hadn't entered space yet successfully ourselves. It was natural to assume that, well, maybe these are visitors from another planet, you know, from outer space. So that kind of meme comes into question, the idea of contact with extraterrestrials. And then we've all seen the Exorcist movies, and the idea of demonic possession and these sorts of things. And that concept goes back much earlier to the beginnings not only of Christianity, but I think that the concept of a demon or a spirit presence entering another person's body goes back probably even further than the institution of Christianity. And it is something that we see in a variety of different cultures and spiritual and religious traditions. So there's that angle to this, that what's being contacted is, as you'd said earlier, either an angel or a demon, and that we perceive those as either being good or bad. There are a lot of different approaches to what's going on here and what kind of contact could be made. Should we examine those potentials and consider whether they may be achieved, through various scientific or spiritual processes? Sure, Does that mean it's necessarily a good idea? I wouldn't advocate that. I certainly wouldn't want to try and contact a demon, whether or not that's something you prescribe to, religiously or otherwise. And so we have to be careful not only in stating what we're talking about, but also the potentials involved in going about it. And if you aren't careful with either of those, I think that you run the risk of coming across as being rather credulous. And again, I think Stephen Greer's kind of fallen into that trap because, again, he's jumping to that conclusion that they're contacting and communicating with extraterrestrials. He may claim that we've seen this the evidence, but I'm just going to put this, and you can quote me on this, I'm going to put this out there. When it comes to UFOs, I have not seen clear evidence that we're dealing with aliens from outer space. They may be aliens from outer space, but there's no empirical scientific data that supports that conclusively. A lot of the data points in that direction, but until we have that proof, we may be dealing with a variety of different things that could be terrestrial in nature, interdimensional in nature. They could be atmospheric anomalies. There could be a whole host of things that UFOs may constitute. And until I've seen proof of alien visitors from outer space, again, I'm going to have a hard time believing that that's who Greer and his accomplices are contacting.
Well, and if you go with the ancient alien theory, then who's really the alien, us or them?
Good point.
Because they were here first, kind of like the Native Americans in America. Columbus didn't discover it because they were already here. It wasn't lost.
It's so funny. Rita, I've got a friend named Nancy Planetta who, during a conversation we were having one afternoon, I was getting really into the idea of artificial intelligence. And I know we're talking about magic mysticism of the molecule, but later this year, I think it's within my jurisdiction now to be able to say, I don't know if I've said this on any radio programs yet, so maybe this is a first for you, but I'd just as soon it be that way because we're friends. I've got a new book that's coming out this December called The UFO Singularity that deals a lot with, humankind's future and things like artificial intelligence. I'll just tell you, a lot of the sort of stuff that we're going to be seeing in that film coming out this summer, Prometheus, that Ridley Scott is doing as a prequel to the Alien films. And which really that concept and that film also, the idea of them, kind of terrifies me. But we'll get into that later. Nancy and I, we were kind of talking about artificial intelligence one afternoon, and she said, "But Micah, thinking about the ancient alien theories, let's take it back. What if we are the artificial intelligence?" Which is essentially, the whole premise behind the ancient astronaut, or what I like to call the paleo-contact theories, is that life on this Earth may have begun or was manipulated by extraplanetary intelligences that may have come here. So, indeed, we very well may be some variety of advanced artificial intelligence ourselves, for all we know. And it does bring to mind the old axiom, which came first, the chicken or the egg. I don't think we would know if we were the chicken or the egg, let alone which one came first.
Well, since we're like dishing up dirt here, I have a new book that I'm hoping is going to be released in October. Crossing my fingers. If I can get all this other junk off my plate and I can finish the editing part. It's called, you'll appreciate this, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods.
I love it already. Wow. So,
because I do believe that we were customized. So, with lots of supporting evidence.
We were the first. We were the first artificial intelligence in a sense. That's fascinating.
Well, no, we weren't even the first. I mean, that's the sad part. We were. Did you ever watch, well, you know, there were those shows, like there was this cartoon when I was a kid, it was called Eighth Man, and it was Eighth Man because he was the eighth iteration. We weren't the first. We were just the ones that survived.
You know, and it brings to mind some of the research of someone else you probably respect and appreciate. If you're anything like me, Brad Steiger. He is someone who, in his infinite wisdom, I was actually having an email exchange with Brad just earlier today, and Brad is working on a new book also, which I don't know if I know the entire title of that or have jurisdiction to give that out on the air yet, but he did contact me and mentioned that he had this because it deals with a lot of things that kind of have to do with some of my own research, and I was corresponding with him, and it brings to mind back in the 1970s some of the books that Brad had been writing. He had written a book called Worlds Before Our Own.
Great book.
Yeah, you know, that explores the potential that maybe, in addition to us not being the first, maybe there were other, I don't know, for lack of a better expression for this, you know, what you might call other attempts at civilization that occurred in humanity's past here on planet Earth. And that's a fascinating concept to me. And again, coming back to this film Prometheus, which again kind of is floating so many of these concepts in that film, whether it's artificial intelligence or alien contact, travel to other worlds, the dangers that could be associated with these kinds of things. In the film Prometheus, I think it was what was it? Maybe Esquire magazine that Ridley Scott was talking about some of these concepts and his inclusion of these in this film. And Scott said that, and I thought this was pretty revelatory, in terms of our ancient past, it doesn't matter if a civilization existed here on this planet billions of years ago, to us at least, because there would be no, and I should probably qualify this to some degree, I think he's right when he says this, there would be no evidence of the existence, or very little, very, very little, had they existed that long ago. And indeed, humans may not be the first. Humans as we know it, this civilization today may not be the first, so to speak. And there was a book written by, what was the journalist's name? I've referenced his work quite a bit, but the book's called A World Without Us, I believe. And there was also a television program that was designed that was based on this. But the concept of a world without humans is that if, in the event humans were somehow wiped off the face of the planet and extinct, how much of the world that we have shaped and changed during our relatively short time here in a cosmological sense, how much of that would continue? How much of that would remain? How much of that would carry on in the absence of humans? And a lot of people take for granted. They think, there would be remaining vestiges of humanity and civilization that would last for thousands and thousands of years. Well, not so. Maybe that's not entirely correct. You know, within a few hundred.
It makes me think of the Planet of the Apes movie. I'm sorry, I love that movie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, and at the end, he goes into the cave, and there's the doll, and he picks it up. Mama! You know, and then he's riding down the beach, and he sees the Statue of Liberty, which totally blew me away. You know, and I was, 7 or 8 years old, and God damn it, they did it. And I was just like, whoa. You know?
Yeah.
But that was only like supposedly 3,000 years in the future, and there was, other than the talking ape part, there was nothing. And that didn't seem unrealistic.
Exactly. And it probably isn't. You know, again, I'm trying to remember the name of the gentleman who wrote that book. It may have been Alan Weiss, but I'm not certain, though. I'll have to look that up. But the point is that what research seems to show is that, and when I say research, we're talking about, for instance, we see how quickly jungles and deserts can swallow up the elements of ancient civilizations that are known to exist, and how quickly, without human maintenance and upkeep, various structures can fall into complete and utter disarray. Knowing also, I think the second law of thermodynamics would dictate, a trend generally toward chaos in this universe. Things though, you don't pick up an egg and throw it on the ground and then expect the egg to reassemble itself and come back together. We know that unfortunately in this universe, energetic systems trend generally toward chaos and a state of disarray. And Without humans around to upkeep and maintain a world that we have created, and this is, again, highly speculative in the sense of, well, what would cause humans just to die out and wouldn't destroy everything else? But let's just assume maybe there was some sort of a disease and it wipes out all of humanity. Literally, without people around to maintain and upkeep the infrastructure of our cities, our highways, our bridges, these things would crumble to the ground and would disappear, and probably the majority of it within a few hundred years. I know a lot of people probably listen to that and they say, "Oh, come on, this is absolute silliness." A few hundred years, but the truth of the matter is that within a few hundred years, without humans around to maintain or upkeep, there's a lot that can happen. Nature has a tendency to take hold. Oak trees tend to sprout from the little cracks in the pavement when there aren't people there to fill those cracks and maintain those roadways. And within a relatively short period, everything would literally just go all to hell. And I'll tell you this. There have been many studies that have said that the long-lasting effects of nuclear and atomic energy may not be fully understood, and that we should be very wary of the way that we dispose of nuclear waste and things like that. And in this circumstance, this would probably be the very same, that if indeed there were going to be any remnants of some civilization that would remain beyond a few thousand years, that would probably have to be the remnants of nuclear facilities. And strangely, as you may know, and I've written about it several times, in the ancient world there are locations, for instance, at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in modern-day Pakistan, that seem to show higher than normal levels of radiation, and even some of the hallmarks of what we have seen at locations like Hiroshima and Nagasaki after World War II. Does that mean that there were nuclear weapons used in ancient times? I don't know. I certainly am not going to put that out here and tell you that that's what has happened. But it's curious to me that, indeed, some of the very few mysteries that are truly, truly anomalous about the ancient world do, on occasion, involve the presence of what appears to be, atomic weaponry or something, some sort of what I like to call a nuclear event. And, indeed, that is the kind of thing that we would expect after several thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, would remain in the absence of humans.
Actually, since we're a plastic society, 3,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now, they'll be digging around and they'll find a McDonald's cup, the plastic kind, not the paper kind, and they'll go, "Oh, it was for ritualistic purposes."
Well, maybe so, yes, indeed. And that's another thing. A lot of people bring up rubbers and plastics and those kinds of things, and whether those could outlast, and therefore that if there had been maybe thousands of years ago some sort of a society here on planet Earth, that they would probably have harnessed that kind of technology as well. But I think something that we take for granted is the tendency for intelligent cultures to be pretty specialized in their technology. I, for one, for instance, am not a proponent of the theory that aliens created the pyramids or something like that. I think humans created those, but then we are left with the apparent impossibility of humans in ancient times being able to construct those kinds of landmarks, those kinds of incredible architectural manifestations. I mean, for ancient people, that must have been incredibly difficult to lift those stones into place and those sorts of things. But what I think we take for granted is that while our culture has evolved in such a way and the progression of technology is used, developed and utilized things such as plastics, ancient cultures obviously weren't using, to the degree at very least that we do today, those sorts of things, and yet they were obviously still capable of technological feats that keep us baffled and that have still kept us baffled to this very day. Philip Coppens, I had him on my program once, and we were talking about the pyramids, and Philip pointed out that he believes geopolymers are behind the construction of the pyramids. And although there's some evidence for this, a lot of people try and discount that because they just can't believe that in ancient times people would have stumbled onto that kind of technology. It's not something that couldn't have been done, in theory. But I think that what we, again, take for granted is that any culture is going to base their technological, at least at the outset, their technological applications and things like that on what is meaningful to them. If they are a theistic society that believes in gods and spirits and totems and things, they're going to build monuments to those gods. and they're going to construct things for religious purposes, temples and this sort of thing. And although there was probably, relative to what we know today, a lot of incredible technology behind the construction of the pyramids, it was highly specialized. And these ancient people who were able to construct these monuments, again, they may not have known about plastic and McDonald's cups and watches, and televisions and things like that, lasers, the things that we have in modern society, but they certainly had their own kind of technology. It was just highly specialized and used relative to what was important and meaningful to them at that time.
And that kind of takes us back into that whole ancient traditions, even when we're talking about, I'm going to say beings without bodies, whether they're ghosts, angels, aliens, interdimensional beings. I feel like these ancient cultures had a much better handle on an understanding of them, looking to explain their nature. And you mentioned way at the beginning of the show, there's not really like a guidebook. Turn to page 47 and you can figure out how to do it. But when you look at some of these spiritual traditions, they kind of have a guidebook. I mean, okay, it involves meditating, and getting clear and doing different things. And actually, I'm going to get you to respond to that when we come back, because I just looked at the clock and it's commercial time. So, but I think that when you look at these spiritual traditions, they really do address accessing these other realms. And I know you have an answer for me. So we'll come back. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Micah Hanks. His book is Magic, Mysticism, and the Molecule. His webpage, Grailient Report, that's GRALIEN report.com. And we'll be back with Micah after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.